Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're really getting into some significant economic moves happening down in South Africa.
That's right. Big news coming out of the South African Reserve Bank, the AZWAR.
Yeah, they've just done two major things. First, they cut interest rates, which is, immediate news.
Hmm. Some breathing room there.
But second, and this is maybe the more intriguing part, they've kind of quietly shifted the country's long-term inflation goal.
It's a fascinating development, quite bold, actually.
Exactly. So our mission today is to unpack what this all means for the economy, for South Africans, maybe even connect the dots globally. We'll be looking at what the SARB said, the government's take, COSATU's reaction, and some economic analysis too.
And it's really crucial to understand these shifts, I think. They're not just abstract numbers. They connect directly to, well, the financial pressures people feel every day, but also the bigger picture for economic growth down the line.
Okay, so let's dive right into that immediate impact, the rate cut. What exactly happened on July 31st?
Okay, so the ARB's Monetary Policy Committee, they made a unanimous decision, which is interesting in itself.
Unanimous, okay.
Yeah. They decided to cut the benchmark repo rate by 25 basis points.
All right, 25 points. So where does that put the rate now?
That brings the repo rate down to 7%. Now, that's its lowest level since November 2022.
Wow. Okay, so quite a significant drop overall recently then. And what does that mean for like the prime lending rate, the rate we actually see from banks?
Right. That's the key part for most people. It means the prime rate, the one commercial banks use for loans like mortgages, car finance, it'll decrease to 10.5%.
10.5%. Okay, that feels like tangible relief. Was this something people were expecting?
It was, yeah, widely anticipated, I'd say. And look, it offers some much-needed relief. As you said, South African households have been under enormous pressure, right? Cost of living has been climbing relentlessly.
You hear that everywhere.
Exactly. And COSATU, the Trade Union Federation, they pointed to a Debt Buster survey. Pretty stark numbers. It showed about 70% of households are struggling with debt.
70%? That's huge.
It really is. Essentials, electricity, transport, food costs are just outpacing wages for so many. So this cut, even 25 points, it helps. And remember, it follows other cuts recently, totaling 75 basis points overall.
Right, so it's part of maybe a gentle easing cycle.
A small easing, yes.
Yeah.
A bit of breathing room and a very tough climate.
And who welcomed this? I imagine COSATU was pleased, given those debt figures.
Oh, definitely. They saw it as direct help for millions of indebted workers. They talked about it helping families afford the basics, maybe freeing up a little cash to spend locally, which helps the economy.
Right, stimulating local demand.
Exactly. And they connected it to bigger goals, too. Boosting savings, creating jobs, making a dent in that really high unemployment rate, which is sitting over 43%.
Oh, yeah, a long way to go there. And the government, were they on board?
They echoed that sentiment, yeah. They talked about easing the burden on consumers, lowering borrowing costs, but also hoping it creates better conditions for businesses to invest and, drive some economic activity.
So general approval on the domestic front. But you mentioned something interesting earlier about timing and global factors.
Ah, yes. This is where it gets quite, well, strategic, maybe. The timing was fascinating. This decision landed just hours before a U.S. deadline related to trade agreements.
Oh, the tariff situation.
Precisely. The U.S. announced this potential new tariff regime, up to 30% duty on some South African exports, set to kick in basically the next day, August 1st.
Wow. So the rate cut wasn't just about easing domestic pain.
It seems not entirely no. It's also being seen as a move to sort of cushion the South African economy, try and brace it for the potential hit from those U.S. tariffs. It suggests this ARB is being quite proactive, looking at both internal and external pressures.
Okay, that adds a whole other layer. So immediate relief, strategic defense. But let's shift gears to that other piece you mentioned, the inflation target. You called it a surprising shift. What's the story there?
Right. This is arguably the bigger, maybe more fundamental change announced. The SARB has effectively shifted its inflation target focus down to 3%.
3%. But isn't the official range 3 to 6%?
It still is, technically. The official band hasn't changed. But Governor Khanyago was quite explicit. He said the bank would now aim for the bottom of the range, which happens to be 3%.
And why is that surprising? I mean, lower inflation sounds good, right?
It is, but the surprise was partly the way it happened. Many market watchers expected the finance minister to formally announce any change to the target, perhaps in the medium-term budget statement in October.
Ah, so the SARB kind of went out on its own on this.
It appears that way, yes. They acted unilaterally, signaling this preference very clearly.
So what's the context here? They were aiming for 4.5% before, weren't they?
Exactly. Since 2017, the operational target has been the midpoint of that 3–6% range, so 4.5%. The bank has actually been arguing for a lower target for about 4 years now.
Why? What's the benefit of aiming even lower?
Their argument is that it makes South Africa more competitive internationally. And crucially, it helps anchor expectations for permanently lower inflation, which then allows for sustainably lower interest rates over the long run.
Okay, so it's a long-term play for stability and lower borrowing costs. Why make this effective shift now?
Well, the timing seems opportunistic, in a good way. Inflation has actually come down quite a bit recently. Headline CPI was at 3% in June, and core inflation, which strips out volatile food and energy prices, was even lower at 2.9%.
So inflation was already at their new preferred level.
Pretty much. It makes it easier to say, okay, let's lock in these gains without needing to inflict more economic pain through significantly higher rates to get inflation down further. They're solidifying the progress made.
Right. So if they're serious about aiming for 3%, what does their own crystal ball, their modeling, say about future interest rates? More cuts coming.
Their own scenario based on this 3% anchor does point towards potentially as many as 5 more rate cuts over the next couple of years.
5 more? Wow.
Yeah, which could potentially bring the repo rate down below 6%. That's quite a bit lower than the endpoint they foresaw under the old 4.5% scenario, which was closer to 7%.
Okay, that sounds pretty significant for borrowers down the line. What are the assumptions behind that, though? Does everything have to go right?
Well, the key assumptions are that inflation expectations, what businesses and unions think inflation will be in the future, actually decline towards this new 3% target.
Yeah.
And also that the rand holds up or strengthens.
And how quickly do those expectations usually shift?
History gives us a clue. When they shifted focus to 4.5% back in 2017, it took about 4 years for expectations to really settle around that level. So it's not an overnight thing, it's a process.
A long game, as you said. Are there risks to this? Pushing for 3%? Could it backfire somehow?
That's always the debate with monetary policy. The positive sign is that the prospect of this lower target seems to have already helped a bit. It's bolstered the rand somewhat and helped lower long-term borrowing costs for the government and big firms.
Oh, okay, so some immediate positive feedback there.
Yes. Governor Iginyago basically framed it as doing what they did in 2017, locking in the gains when inflation is already low. He acknowledged policy changes are never easy, and the Treasury is still running its own models on the implications.
Did he address the potential difficulties?
He did. He said, changing policy is never easy, but followed up with, the benefits outweigh the costs. The general economic thinking is that countries with lower, more stable inflation targets tend to bounce back better from economic shocks. But getting there requires careful management.
Okay, so it's a calculated risk, aiming for greater long-term stability. Let's pull back a bit then. How does all this, the rate cut, the inflation shift, fit into the wider economic picture for South Africa right now? What are the growth forecasts looking like?
Well, the picture is still pretty mixed, honestly. The SARB actually revised down its GDP growth forecast slightly for this year, 2025, to 0.9%. That's down from 1.1%. And for 2026, it's down to 1.3% from 1.5%.
Oh, so growth is actually expected to be a bit weaker in the near term.
In the immediate term, yes. Though they did nudge up the forecast for 2027 slightly, to 2%. The underlying issues are still there. Persistent problems on the supply side, logistics, ports, rail, they continue to be a drag. And there's still a lot of uncertainty, which dampens business and consumer confidence.
And how did the markets, like the rand, react overall after both announcements came out?
The rand actually weakened a bit initially, slipping to around R18.19 against the US dollar.
Why weaken if there's a rate cut and a move towards lower inflation?
Well, investors are juggling a few things. They're looking at the difference in monetary policy paths between, say, the U.S., where rates might stay higher for longer, and South Africa, which is cutting. Plus, those trade tensions we talked about are definitely casting a shadow.
Right, the tariff threat adds nervousness. Any specific sectors happy about the rate cut?
Oh yeah, the property sector definitely welcomed it. Groups like Pam Golding Properties mentioned they expected to support demand, especially from first-time buyers who are usually very sensitive to interest rate changes.
Makes sense. So, okay, the SARB is making these moves, rate cuts, inflation anchor shifts. But it sounds like for a lot of people, especially those 70% struggling with debt, this is helpful, but maybe not transformative on its own. What else needs to happen?
That's exactly the point COSATU and others are making. They're very clear. Monetary policy can't fix everything. They're calling for much broader action.
Like what?
Things like Eskom needing to bring down electricity costs a huge burden. getting Metro Rail fully operational to cut transport costs for workers, making sure Transnet, the ports and rail operator, is running efficiently so food and goods don't face unnecessary inflation from logistics bottlenecks.
So tackling those structural, almost infrastructural problems.
Exactly. And Cossadio also stressed the need to address the wage gap and improve the social wage areas like public services, healthcare, education, to make life fundamentally more affordable for the working class and the poor.
Does the SARB acknowledge that these other reforms are needed? Or do they see their job as purely managing inflation and rates?
No, they definitely acknowledge it. Governor Kajinyago explicitly said that the tough global environment really highlights the urgency of domestic reform for accelerating growth.
So they see the limits of their own tools.
Absolutely. The SARB listed other critical areas too. Getting public debt under control, strengthening those network industries like energy and transport, lowering administered prices, think government-set fees like electricity tariffs, and ensuring wage growth doesn't outstrip productivity gains.
So a whole reform agenda is needed.
Pretty much. The SARB sees its core job as delivering price stability, locking in that low inflation to pave the way for lower interest rates long term. But they're clear that achieving sustainable higher growth requires much broader reforms across the economy, largely outside their direct control.
Okay, so wrapping this up, it's been quite a deep dive. We've seen the SARB make two really significant moves. That immediate relief from the repo rate cut, trying to ease the pressure now.
And cushioning against those potential trade headwinds.
Right. And then this bolder, perhaps more controversial strategic shift towards aiming for a 3% inflation anchor, playing the long game for stability.
Yeah, a move that signals their confidence, but also happened in a way that surprised some observers.
And it's all happening against this backdrop of needing much wider economic reforms and dealing with global pressures like those U.S. tariffs.
It really underscores the complexity of managing an economy like South Africa's right now.
Okay.
So here's maybe a final thought to chew on.
Okay.
Given that the SARB seems to have acted quite proactively, maybe even unilaterally, in shifting towards this 3% inflation anchor, what does that mean for how the central bank and the government work together on economic policy going forward? Does it create new opportunities for coordination or maybe new challenges as South Africa tries to find that path to sustainable growth and stability? What really stands out to you?
That's a really interesting question to ponder. How does that dynamic play out? A lot to think about indeed. Thanks for joining us today for this deep dive. Hopefully it's given you a clearer perspective on these important economic shifts.